All right, everybody, good evening. Welcome to Book Court tonight. We're here tonight with Lyndsay Faye and Maria Konnikova. Lyndsay is the author of Gods of Gotham, which was an Edgar Award nominee for Best Novel. Her story, Dust and Shadow, was featured in Best American Mystery Stories in 2010. She lives in Manhattan with her husband Gabriel, and she's the author now of Seven for a Secret. She'll be in conversation with Maria Konnikova, who is a contributing writer for The New Yorker online. She formerly is the writer of Literally Psyched, the column for Scientific American. Her publication credits are too numerous to mention here, but she did get a degree from Harvard, PhD from Columbia, and also lives here in New York City. She's the author of the book Mastermind, How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. We had a great event for her here at Book Court when her book came out, so we're thrilled to have her back. We're thrilled to have the two of them here. So thanks to all of you for coming tonight. We're here tonight. Please welcome Lyndsay Faye and Maria Konnikova.
I'm so excited so many people are here. Also, can I just say for the record that I think this is going to be something of a surreal experience for Maria and I, because it's like we have lunch together a lot, so it's going to be like we're having lunch together, but a bunch of people are watching. So it'll be like our lunch.
So when I ask what to order for dessert, please just ignore that.
Yeah, exactly. We'll fall into old habits.
Yes. But I figured that we'd start with some conversation and then open it up for questions. And if you want Lyndsay to read part of her brilliant book, then she will certainly do that as well. Sound good?
I can. I wait for requests on that subject, because if you solely write books in male narrators who don't have your accent, it can end up sounding kind of funny when you read your own book. I think I've been shooting myself in the foot that way for years now. But I would be happy to read it if you'd like me to.
All right. Well, so I will kick us off here. So for those of you who aren't aware, this is the second book of a trilogy. There's a third one coming, and we're very excited about that. But I remember talking to you about the first book, which was Gods of Gotham, and when I asked you for the inspiration for that, you said, my inspiration was Cop 1, Day 1 of the New York City Police Department. So, which is a really interesting, I think, premise. And here you start, the police department has already been founded. Your main character is kind of already part of the police force. So how did you pick this narrative, which is quite different, without giving away too many spoilers, from the previous one? What was kind of the pivotal thing that made you think, oh, this is where it should go from Cop 1, Day 1?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that for a while I spent a long, dark tea time of the soul trying to write what I thought were artistic books, between writing Dust and Shadow and writing The Gods of Gotham. And then when I wrote The Gods of Gotham, I realized that if I was angry enough about something, I could really carry myself through a narrative, like just with rage. So, at the time that I wrote The Gods of Gotham, there was a lot of backlash happening against Muslims, specifically in New York City. It was about the Irish arriving in New York City at the same time the police department was founded. So in 1845, both the police department, the NYPD, and the Irish potato famine really kicked off, which was a historical confluence of events that was obviously none of my doing, but was an absolutely amazing story. And I thought that was a story that needed to be told. So I was also, at the time, they were trying to build a Muslim rec center down near the World Trade Center. I don't know if you remember that happening. But there were a lot of religious slurs that were just sort of flying around various news media that exactly reflected the structure and the syntax of the things that were being said about Catholics when they arrived in the United States. And it was so similar when I was doing the research that it really fueled me when I was writing Seven for a Secret, which the premise of that is essentially if you take 12 Years a Slave in reverse, this is the story of the vigilance committees who were in places like Philadelphia, Boston, New York City, big metropolises where free African Americans would have been immediate targets for being, kidnapped, and the worst form of identity theft you can imagine is being accused of being a runaway slave and then just hauled off and having absolutely no legal recourse to get out of it. So that was happening at the same time that a lot of very strange political things were occurring surrounding the new Obama administration. And there was a lot of, there was just a lot of racist stuff that was flying around everywhere. And I saw so much of it that, again, it sort of, and then people started saying that racism in America wasn't over. And I started, throwing up a little bit every time anyone said that. But then I would quietly spit in the sink and go back to writing. So it was one of those, I'm writing something that I feel really passionate about instead of trying to sit down and write something that I think is important. It's important to me. It's important to us. It's personal. We go through this stuff all the time. It's happening to our country still, and the parallels were disturbing. And I sat down and I essentially wrote the story of the vigilance committees who were the other side of Solomon Northrop's story in 12 Years a Slave, where he is kidnapped and sold as a slave, and these are the people who are trying to prevent that from happening. And the politics at the time absolutely egged me on. So it was very similar motives for both books, believe it or not.
And yet your main character, Timothy Wilde, is not a politician. He's a police officer. And your first book, Dust and Shadow, was about Sherlock Holmes.
True facts.
It was, for those of you who haven't read it.
For those of you who haven't heard of Sherlock Holmes here.
For those of you who haven't read the first book.
Maria and I like Sherlock Holmes.
We do.
Yeah.
But it's Sherlock Holmes, basically pastiche. So it's Sherlock Holmes catching Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
Looking to catch Jack the Ripper. And so, it struck me that you've really kept, in a sense, you're now dealing with a very different political reality, and obviously you're no longer in London, you're now in New York.
I'm back in London right now.
You're back in London now. Interesting, we can talk about that later. But it struck me that you seem to be really fascinated by this detective police officer figure, because Timothy isn't your typical police officer.
Yeah.
He is more of a rogue detective. He goes off the books and he has his own little niche within the police department where he's allowed to operate in his own little world as kind of a New York 19th century Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
Why is that? What is kind of, let's put Holmes aside, but just say, what's the draw of that sort of figure?
Well, I think that's very apt, and not putting Holmes aside for 2 seconds. There are aspects of Timothy that I wrote deliberately to be unlike Sherlock Holmes. He's 5'4". He is in love with a beautiful woman who he can't have. He wears his heart on his little elbow. I think he has a patch for it. He's like this tiny angst ball of emotions. He doesn't think he's clever. He thinks that he's inadequate to the task. He is not arrogant. He is not, sort of urbane and sophisticated. He's this regular scrapper, who kind of came up from the dirt. So there were decisions that I made along those lines deliberately that were, how much not like Sherlock Holmes can I make this guy? At the same time, everyone since Conan Doyle is kind of writing Sherlock Holmes pastiches. This was the original form of the independent detective, apart from obviously Siebel's Dupin and Poe stories, but those were not emotionally gripping in the way I would argue. And if you're emotionally gripped by Dupin, then I'm sorry. But he spends a lot of time, sort of sitting at a desk, and he's like, I'm ratiocinating, ratiocination, and you're like, okay, rock on, dude. But It's not really, he never leaves, he's an armchair detective, essentially. Sherlock Holmes, they weren't the mysteries of Sherlock Holmes, they weren't the cases of Sherlock, the case book is the final one. They were never the mysteries of Sherlock Holmes, they were the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, they were adventures. These are, people who are getting their hands dirty, right? I'm very drawn to that. What I'm drawn to about I think specifically, figure of the detective who operates to a certain extent within the law and to a certain extent outside of it, and to that, I think what you're speaking to is that Tim and Sherlock are actually kind of identical in that way, in that they're partly within the law and working with the law, and they're partly just doing whatever the hell they want, That is because I find gray things much more interesting than black things and white things. And I think there are so many black things and white things in the way people paint each other that if you explore shades on a continuum and why was this a good decision, why was this a bad one? Also, I have said before, I said to my agent once actually, I think we were at BotcherCon watching some brilliant panel and I turned to her and I kind of realized it and I said, I don't actually really write books about crime, I write books about love. Because people in my books are always doing something because they're either passionate about something or someone. And I find the idea of exploring a flawed moral compass really interesting. So I like first person for that reason. I like landing in a first person narrative and saying, this moral compass, that's what this book is about, and to what extent does it work, to what extent doesn't it work? Because that's the space we're all in, right? We go through everyday life just making these decisions moment after moment after moment, trying to figure out what is the best thing for me, what is the best thing for the person most important to me, for the people who are most important to me, what's the best thing for my community, and then what's the honorable thing to do, And so I write things that I think inevitably involve courage and self-sacrifice because I'm obsessed with those sorts of themes, and I think that you can find them in the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, which is why I love them so much, and then that's definitely why I write them.
So let's shift gears and talk about con artists. Just because I love them and I'm writing a book about them right now.
She is, and it's going to be amazing.
But also because, for no spoilers for those of you who haven't read the book, but basically at the center of your narrative you have con artists.
In this book. It's a long con.
It's a long con, and I think it's fascinating that you really talking about kind of moral ambiguity and no shades of black and white. It's a funny choice of language.
Well, for this book particularly,
yeah, since you're dealing with race. But it's fascinating because where I'm coming from, all con artists are kind of bad to a certain extent.
Because they're trying to take something.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And here you have definite, this is a clear-cut case of con artists.
Definitely.
And yet, they make me...
False identity.
Yeah, they make me question a little bit whether all con artists are necessarily evil. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I do explore those themes often. I think Timothy has this list of terrible things that his brother Valentine is guilty of, right? He has this long list of flaws and moral failings that his brother, is egregiously it's quite extensive. But I like exploring when it's a better moral decision to do the wrong thing than it is the right thing. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. When is it a loftier moral decision to lie than to tell the truth? When is it more ethical to kill someone than not to? When is it, and exploring those things, I don't have any answers to these questions, I just put those questions out there. But one of my favorite passages from all of literature is absolutely from Huck Finn. And I love that book, and I think so many people love that book. But towards the end of Huck Finn, he is trying to decide whether or not to say, Jim, yeah, I stole this guy. He's a slave. I have to give him back. I have to tell who I robbed where her slave is. And the decision he makes is, all right then, I'll go to hell. And I think it's one of the most beautiful sentences ever to be written, because he would rather go to hell for what he perceives as a core moral decision than turn in his friend, because that connection is so strong. And at what point do we look at rules that we have in our society and laws in our society and say, maybe that's not such a good idea. Maybe we should shift our own moral focus. Maybe what we should do is not have this rule. Maybe queer people should be allowed to get married. I mean, maybe all sorts of things should. Maybe we should question these things. And the questioning the law to the extent that a kid, that like a little kid would say, I'm gonna go to hell because I want him to stay free, is, I think, really beautiful. So I find that deeply inspiring. And in terms of the long con, in Seven for Secret, it's a similar situation. And it is, I think, entirely morally justifiable, but whether you think that or not is up to you, because I think that it's a question of making people ask, you know? It's like just let's look at it and let's question that. Let's just say maybe sometimes doing the wrong thing is actually doing the right thing. And when is that happening? And you know, how do we not be sheep? How do we not just wander around doing exactly what we're meant to be doing? How do we not fall into the trap of doing precisely what it profits the big guys for us to do? Why don't we look at it and say, I'm independent-minded and I can see for myself that this is the choice I'm going to make, and I'm not going to feel guilty about it, or I'm going to feel guilty about it, but I'm going to say this is a better choice than my alternative. And I do also like driving, unfortunately, I like driving characters to terribly desperate measures, for which I apologize, because I love them. So the more I love them, I'm like, it's like, oh man, I love you. Like, it's horrifying. So I do terrible
And
things.
they die.
Yeah, I do. I do terrible things to my favorite
She's a
characters.
George R. Martin.
I'm not that bad. I'm a J.K. Rowling, alright? Like, or George. Oh God, George. But George, my heart. He said something about the Red Wedding, if we could, sorry, riff off of that for a second. George R. R. Martin, George R. I always forget how many. Martin said regarding the Red Wedding that it was the hardest thing he ever had to write. He skipped it initially, right? He wrote the whole book, and then he's like, you have to write this shit. Oh, you have to write it. You have to sit down, you have to actually write it. You have to kill these people that you love. And he said, it was so hard, and he said that if you love a book, if you truly love a narrative, if you love characters, it shouldn't be, when you read it, like, oh, I'm just gonna go heat up some popcorn. Like, this should not be your reaction. Like, it should not just be about adrenaline. It should be about losing someone that you really care about, and I think that that's beautiful.
I got nothing. One more question about the book, and we can talk a little bit more broadly about writing for people who haven't actually read it. But I am fascinated by the character of Silky Marsh, because how can you not be fascinated by a madam who runs the most insane brothel in Soho? She's in Soho, right?
Oh, she's on Spring. So
On
she's
Spring Street. Yeah, that's Soho.
Yeah.
In old school Soho. Before
I think of it as
Soho.
Ward 8.
Oh.
I had to actually process this. Do you understand? I had to process, like Maria said she's in Soho, and I'm like,
Precinct number 8.
I'm like, she's in Ward 8. What is Ward 8? So, yeah. Yeah.
She's just riveting, and she is someone who, talk about complex characters. I mean, she has a child brothel, for God's sake, and does all sorts of terrible things, and
Yeah.
yet, I kind of love her.
I'm so glad. I kind of love her too. Silky Marsh. She is.
Anyway, isn't that a great name, Silky Marsh?
Silky Marsh. I've been told my names are very Dickensian. This is a calculated thing. This is not an accident. Mercy Underhill. You know, for instance, Mercy Underhill. Well, I think you can parse something from that name if you squint at it for long enough. But Silky Marsh, yeah, she fascinates me too. I'm not.
And you haven't killed her yet, so.
I have no plans to. She serves two purposes, I think, in the narrative. One, I think that obviously you need a nemesis worthy of your foeman's steel, you know? And she's not exactly Professor Moriarty because she is cruel and she is calculating and she is kind of trying to take over as much of Tammany as she can and have her fingers as many metaphorical and literal pies as she possibly can put them in. But she also, I think, she's entropy because you don't really know what she's going to do. And there's a moment in Seven for a Secret. It's actually, Melinda's here right now, and Melinda gave me this idea, and it was brilliant. I had written this scene in a particular way in Seven for a Secret, and she was being very badass, but she was also, you know, it was like, what if she did something generous suddenly? Isn't that scarier? Like, isn't it scarier if the horrifying, you know, like, supervillain suddenly does something nice and then you're totally thrown off by where she's coming from? And like, I loved that idea. I thought that was like the best idea, and I love having, you know, like friends who will read things early and tell me things like that because I'm like, yeah, God, yeah, perfect. Because I conceived her, and the term didn't exist at the time. So like, so many terms didn't exist at the time. The Reverend Underhill and the Gods of Gotham, and like, we're not doing Gods of Gotham, spoiler alerts tonight, I hope. But well, yes, we can. Anyway, I conceived, we can do that. I conceived him as a particular pathology, and I conceived Silky Marsh specifically. I thought that she was a sociopath. And the fact that she's a sociopath is so much fun because, yes, she is super selfish, but she can be selfish in the right.
I love that sentence.
She can be selfish in the right direction at the same time that she can be selfish in the other direction, you know? Like, she's not always necessarily a force for horrifying evil. And so she's also, you know, she's super feminist in a really, like, perverse sense. In a horrible, perverse sense.
But you know, it's sort of the same perverse sense talking about modern politics and how it goes back to, to old times.
Yeah.
There is still a huge kind of social stigma against prostitution and against people who actually willingly go into that.
And with her, there
And
should
really-
be because she's got,
Of
you know,
course.
underage people. But with the rest of it,
But she's very understanding of the women who actually want to do that.
Yes.
And I think that's really cool. That's
Yeah.
something that I think a lot of us aren't still. So-
Well, and she likes to throw in the face of people who are moralizing at her that, really, what would you do?
It's interesting. She makes you think. She definitely makes you think.
I hope so, because it would, you know, you can have. I like also writing, and for the third book in the trilogy, I wrote this completely loathsome human who, like, you look at Silky Marsh and you go, oh man, thumbs up.
Looking forward to
This person, no. Like, by comparison, she is Mother Teresa, but she's all about practicality. Like, she's not a sadist, is the thing. Like, that's not what she's after. She's not particularly after anybody suffering. She's just about profit and about benefit, and she has absolutely no moral qualms about any of it. Whatever she can do to profit, that's what she's going to do.
businesswoman.
She's a businesswoman, and occasionally she'll do something that's actually kind of nice, which is creepy. Thanks, Lynn.
So now let's go away from plot a little bit and go into the writing process. I have never written a trilogy, and I find it's really interesting to think about, well, how do you carry an idea? How do you keep yourself kind of motivated to carry it, not for just one book, but for 3? So let's talk about that for a little bit. How is that for you? How do you conceive it?
Oh man, it was a long road. You know, The Gods of Gotham could have been a standalone, I think, easily. But as a standalone, I wanted to know more about these people, and it was because I was curious. I was intellectually and emotionally curious about what would happen to these people. So it was completely selfish. And I was like, but then what do they do? Like, these brothers were so screwed up, like, and are just, you know, a hot mess at each other. Like, what do they do after they find out who each other really are? So there's a reveal at the end of The Gods of Gotham where it becomes much more clear to Timothy and Valentine where each of them are coming from. 7 for a Secret set 6 months later. So I had done religious persecution, essentially, in The Gods of Gotham, because it was important to me at the time. I did racial persecution in 7 for a Secret. It made a lot of sense to me to do gender persecution in the third book in the trilogy, which is called The Fatal Flame, and it's going to be out in 2015. But in The Fatal Flame, it's about essentially decades before Triangle Shirtwaist, what the very first manufactory seamstresses were doing. Like, the very first women who went to work and who had to go through that, and who, you know, they were working for a wage, they were out there, they were not in the home as domestic servants, they were not in the home as wives, they were not in the home as daughters, they were not on the streets as prostitutes, they were in none of these places. They were in this crazy new place called a manufactory, where you went and you got paid to do a thing, and then you went home. And if you read the screeds written by men on the subject from the time period, which are of course all quoted at the beginning of chapters, like I always do, it's kind of staggering. Not unexpected, but staggering. Because women were doing this going to work thing, not because they were like, yeah, let's steal jobs from dudes. That would be awesome. Like, that was not the plan. The plan was like, how would I not starve to death in a ditch? Woo! You know. So that was more of the plan than you know, the former scenario. And so in that sense, the trilogy has 3 major themes in terms of people who are being attacked, who are not necessarily, they're very similar to people who are being attacked now, but they're not identical. Too many of the themes carry through into today, and as I said, that's fueled really all the time for me politically. But writing a trilogy, I didn't know when I was in the middle of the third one, whether it was the third book in a trilogy or it was the third book in a series of, you know, 10 books. And then I get to 150,000 words, which if you've ever picked up Brood, you know that hardcover Brood strong people? I'm like, kill me. I figured it out, and it was an emotional arc. It was not a historical arc. It's about the brothers. The trilogy is about the brothers, and it's about their relationship, and it's about Tim growing up. Essentially, he's already a grown-up when you meet him in some senses, but he's not a grown-up in the same way that he's a grown-up at the end of the third book, I think. And he figures out a lot of things about his family, and I think that it was the emotional arc that I saw ending, and it was ending in a way that I thought was perfect, and I hope other people like it, but I thought it was the way I wanted to do it. And what I said to myself, I woke up one morning and I was like, I'm not ever going to write a bad Timothy Wilde novel. I'm not going to just keep, you know, like doing them because, you know, it's a self-perpetuating. And now, could I potentially one day imagine switching narrators and having similar characters in a book? Yes, absolutely. I'm not saying that they're not dead or anything like that. But the
Guys, end of the third book, there's still
there's potential for more, but not from Tim Wilde's perspective, because like I, as a writer, I play with the first person unreliable narrator so much. I just muck with that all the time, and Tim is so well intentioned and so unreliable. Like, you can't listen to a word he says at the same time he's super earnest. You're like, he's so earnest. He must be telling the truth, and he is telling the truth as far as he can see it, but like, we're all really blind to things that are right in front of us. So I had taken that as far as it could go, and I thought that, I had taken it to a peak, and I had, boom, it was the third act. It was the third act. And yeah, when I initially wrote Gods of Gotham, I didn't know that it was going to be a trilogy, but it turned into, I have a lot of theater background, and it seems like it's in my DNA at this point. It's like this 3-act structure. I can't not least for Tim, because it's like it's an emotional payoff mostly, I think, and it's not because there aren't more stories. It's not because he doesn't continue fighting crime. It's because that particular book, I think, really encapsulated how he came to be a man. You know.
Well, in a way, that question would be the perfect ending point, but I have just one more because we have to go back to George R.R. Martin because that's the most important part of this trivia. And
She's not wrong.
so you
I
guys
think there's a couple more R's in there than she's not.
And there's a similarity between the two of you that goes beyond killing characters. And that's so
I've never been more flat.
so he invents languages. You know, you've got Dothraki, you've got High Valyrian. Now you've got, I don't remember the dude who writes for the television show, but he's now created, you know, up to over 4,000 words, part of this vocabulary, very intense structure, and it's really awesome, and people kind of love it.
Like Tolkien did back in the day.
Right, and you haven't actually, and there's some R's in there as well.
J-R-R. What is it with people and a bunch of R's in the middle of their name?
I'm changing my name, I'm Maria R.R.R.
I want to be Lyndsay R.
So, you don't quite have Dothraki in here, but you do invent a language by going back in time to a language that no one knows how it was used, which is Flash.
Right.
This criminal underground language, which is really fascinating. I love that in all your books you have glossaries because you actually kind of need them.
Yeah,
And I
particularly if someone's never picked it up before.
Right, and I actually have tried to read it without the glossary, and it's like a foreign language. You kind of try to parse what it is.
It's like
And
reading
sometimes you
Clockwork
don't-
Orange.
Right, and sometimes you don't define a word, and I get kind of mad because I can't figure out what it means, and I want to know. But that is such an interesting theme with you. This kind of, it's not just a love of language. It's kind of this desire to create a different vernacular in which your characters can communicate.
Language fascinates me, and I'm only looking like I'm about to start giggling because have you ever heard Stephen Fry from A Bit of Fry and Laurie on the subject of language? Language is my mother, my father, my sister, my whore, my checkout girl. Language is the breath of God. Language is amazing, and I think that everyone YouTube, that's got Stephen Fry. Language.
5-minute break.
5 minutes. No, or I could just recite it for you right now. Language is organic, and language is a fascinating kind of creature. I think that there are different cultures that try to, they don't try to, they look at language in different ways. You have a culture that springs up, and that culture creates the language that you need for that culture. You have, the language is a product of the people who need it. It's not an abstract construction, it's an organic thing. It's like watching a tree grow. This is what we need in order to be able to communicate. And English is, if we're going to hugely oversimplify it, the result of a train wreck between Anglo-Saxon and French, right? So, and then it's about 900 other things as well. And I have such fascination with not advanced linguistics. I never took any of those courses, but I think that language is really interesting in the way we use language to communicate, because ultimately isn't this all about communication? And isn't it about making ourselves clear to ourselves and making each other clear to each other and trying to, understand ourselves and each other better? Language is limited. Language in I did this a little bit with Miss Monk in Dust and Shadow, actually, because she speaks thieves' cant, which, if you were to Boker Romany back in the day, thieves' cant was the Cockney sort of slang long before rhyming slang happened, although they did do that at the time a little bit. But when thieves' cant came across the pond, it turned into a dialect called Flash. And the useful thing about Flash was that if you were one of these sort of criminal classes, or if you just lived near them and happened to know what they were talking about, because language also travels very much by osmosis, you could speak without the authority figures around you knowing what you were talking about, speaking of cons. Because you could
Right,
just
so
sort
it's
of,
not their own language.
they had their own language. And the book that I have that anyone can order for I think like $8 or $10 on the internet, George Washington Matzel, who was the first police chief, and he actually served as police chief for 12 years. He wrote a book called Vocabulum, The Secret Language of Crime. It's also referred to as the Rogues Dictionary in another title. And what he did, and he was fascinated by language too, and he's a big character in all three of the books, and he would record these things that his copper stars didn't understand. He would write down these words and he would figure out their translations. And what he wanted to do was write a lexicon so that his police officers would know if someone's like, I'm gonna shank that dude, like, what it meant. Like, this was really practical. Like, you should know, I'm gonna shank that dude means a particular thing, and if you don't know what the word shank means, then you're not gonna be able to shiv. It would have been shiv in flash pattern, so I'll translate shank to shiv. I'm gonna shiv that dude, is what they would have said. But I have that dictionary.
Unforgivable.
Sorry. So I have that dictionary, and I found it fascinating. Particularly the corruptions from thieves' cant into Flash are kind of hilarious for many reasons. But then it developed into, there were German slang words added, there were Yiddish slang words added, there were slang words added from all over the place that were uniquely American, that were like tossed into the secret language of crime, as he would have called it. And I loved that. I loved how American it was, I loved how organic it was, and I wanted them to speak in the language of the time, because when I read historical fiction, and I do try not to make it too complicated, so 90% of the time, and you're right, there's that 10% where I'm a jerk, but 90% of the time it's either defined within the sentence or in the glossary, or if not in the sentence, then in the paragraph following. But like, yeah, I sometimes am a jackass about that. But I think that it's so colorful, and so much of it reflects the humor and the culture of the time period, because these people lived really bleak lives. You know, they were ridiculously poor. They had no social service